So generally, how many people do come on?
We have 10 that RSVP to the invite that I sent out last week. So I would count those as pretty likely to all show up. But as in schools, things happen. And so people might come late, might drop off early, what have you. So let's give everybody a couple minutes, but I would say, I can look at the invite again, but I am pretty sure. Yeah, we have 10 yeses, 3 nos, and 10 that didn't RSVP, that didn't respond. Those are all people who have gone through the process of registering in the first place. So, but you never know. Great. Jen, did I ever connect you with the woman in Southern California about internships?
No, you mentioned it, but that was when you were all deathly ill.
Oh, okay. So her name is Stephanie, and she's at Vistamar.
Okay.
And I will send an email out this afternoon connecting you two, because they're really talking about equity and opportunity for internships. Mostly in that their internship programs right now are sort of student driven in terms of coordinating them. They're senior internships. And so she's trying to make it less so that a child with no family contacts to an amazing internship has the same opportunities as somebody whose dad has access to, amazing things.
Right.
I'm going to strategically eavesdrop here and say, I'd welcome any thoughts along those lines here, because this is a challenge for us as well.
Oh, okay. So, I'm going to put you on the email then, Eric. Okay?
It would be great. Sorry to jump in there, but this is like a meta question that we are facing here. So all ideas welcome.
Well, then maybe we should do a Google or a webinar or whatever we call these things.
That'd be great.
That would truly.
Sorry, I don't know why somebody's calling.
Dana.
Hey, Rebecca. How's it going?
How are you? Good. How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Hey, Blake.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. Oh, I'm so glad there's lots of people here. This is excellent. I have to figure out how I want to look at you all. Do I want to look at you in a grid or in a bar? So first off, I'm so grateful you're all here. I'm sorry that we postponed this conversation the last time. And I would like to welcome you all here to talk about how we can best merge diversity, equity, and inclusion work with community engagement and partnerships. I have asked Rebecca Hong from Spence School to speak to us a little bit about what Spence's vision is with this work and how they put it into practice. And then we will open it up to an active conversation with questions and discussion afterwards. So thank you all for being here.
Great, thank you, Blake. So hi, everybody. I wanted to just talk, I want to make clear from the very outset that what I'm about to say about Spence is not to claim that what we're doing has figured all of this out, or that we have seamless practice with regard to integrating our equity in our service work. We don't. It's an ongoing challenge to figure out how to keep equity and service work at the center of people's concerns. Particularly, I'm finding, having come from the West Coast, in an East Coast environment where content and curriculum is often driven by tradition in ways that make it difficult to do this kind of thinking as a basis of our prioritization. There isn't as much love for good and for bad, of thinking in terms of design thinking, innovation, and interdisciplinarity, I find. I don't think that's Spence specific, as I understand it from talking to colleagues in the New York area. It's really, there's challenges to every region, and I think this might be just the East Coast way. So that's all to just preface what we're doing is really exciting. Some of the things that I came into, which were a real benefit to me and my work as an equity director is a school who already understood that an equity and diversity and inclusion director needed to be somebody who was a resource to people who already cared about the work, that my job was not to get people to care or be engaged with it. And so what that meant is I had a lot of people coming in. There was about, a good decade of prep work before I came, where people were asked to think about how their practice integrated equity already without somebody on the ground doing that work for them. So people were asked to do that thinking around equity work prior to my arrival, with a sort of strategic sense that then once I came, I would be a desirable resource for people, if that makes sense. So people came in wanting to work with me, wanting to collaborate with me. And I wasn't one of those people in the DE&I field, as you all know, often in schools, what happens is that person is a person of color who then gets relegated to an office and is isolated from things that are going on in the school environment. That's not what's happening here, and in large part because they didn't have a person in that office. Everybody has a sense that they're responsible for the equity work, including, although this isn't just because of the school she was in, Danielle Pasno, who was the director of outreach and public purpose, who you all know, or many of you may know, I don't know, maybe not. I see some nods, and I know some of you have worked with her, but she used to be the person. She's now the middle school head at Browning, which is a school in New York, but she was the public purpose and outreach person. We no longer have a person, because last year she and I spent a lot of time thinking about what did and didn't work about her role as an outreach person in our school and a public purpose person. And what was challenging for her is really getting that integration that I just talked about equity already having. So that desire from other people. When she was a person, she had to go to them and try to convince them that they should do service learning, that they should be thinking differently about the community service projects they were doing, that she could help them design curriculum. We spent a lot of time doing some vision thinking, the two of us, and also examining tools both of us have used in our practice, which is specifically the anti-bias education tools, which if you don't know them, I would highly recommend them. The Teaching Tolerance has the anti-bias education framework on their website, and it's easily accessible if you just search in Google for the anti-bias standards and teaching tolerance. And I don't know if you've seen them. For the folks who are here, have you seen them, those standards? So they have standards K through 12. For 4 categories and 4 pillars that they consider in anti-bias education. The first is identity, the second is diversity, the third is justice, and the fourth is action. And they are very clear. It's a very clear visual for people to look at that they can use to connect their understanding of service and equity work, because it is basically the understanding that identity development is part of all purposeful action and justice in the world, and that deep understanding of diversity and your role, your identity within that diversity is part of the practice of thinking about fairness, thinking about justice, and thinking about what you may do in the world to do anything about all of that. And what's really remarkable about it is that it becomes clear once you look at a clear 4-part framework that identity work doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that justice or action work, they don't exist in vacuums either, because without all of the other sort of scaffolding, without the other pillars, the structure is not stable. And I would say the structure overall, although Teaching Tolerance doesn't say this, is really the purpose, the idea of purpose. What's your purpose? Like, what are you good at? And that's to the work, Shana, that you all do. What are you good at? Who are you? And what, therefore, how do you act in the world for contributing to the world? And I think one of the reasons why all of this was so alluring is because I'd been using the anti-bias standards for a long time. And one of my goals as an educator for the last 15 years has been to think about equity not as an extracurricular activity and not as an advising time curriculum, goal or a assemblies and after school programming, but to really get a sense that identity development and diversity understanding were key parts of education, and any good education, that was necessary. It should be assessed. It should be curricular. It should show up across the disciplines. And I think the anti-bias framework helped me understand how to articulate that clearly, with standards, with curricular standards. For Danielle, the same thing was true for the action piece. And both of us had the challenge that when we saw our work being done, our realm of work being done poorly, it was because they weren't connected to that kind of framework. So I'll give you an example. When you are doing service work, and you have, say, Spence sends their lower school kids out to, we've stopped this now, but we used to send lower school kids out to a soup kitchen that was about 4 blocks away from our school. Spence is a predominantly white institution and a historically white institution. The kids are 80% full pay. They have significant resources, the majority of them, but not all of them. They would send a lower school class for a soup kitchen visit so that they could help do some of the kitchen work in the soup kitchen. And that was, because of proximity, there were a lot of things that were right about it. It was in our neighborhood. It was taking care of our neighborhood. But the challenge is 2 blocks from here, the neighborhood it starts to become more noticeably and predominantly Black. And the clientele of the soup kitchen are almost all people of color. And so you had these white girls going into this environment where they were making all sorts of assumptions about what it meant to be, who was on one side of the line and who was on the other. And they would bring those into the classroom. And there weren't really structures to help them think through why it was that all of the people in getting served the food were people of color, and why all the people on the other side, the majority of them, when they went into the spaces as 10 kids, would be white kids. So there's, you can do damage. In Danielle's language, you can do serious damage. You can do more damage than not doing service work if you're doing service work poorly, if you're not doing it with an equity lens, if you're not doing it with equity teaching and learning. And in my realm, I think the biggest challenge, which all of you are probably grappling with if you're in schools, is the issue of call out culture, and really thinking about identity as something to use as a weapon, and something that kids can use against each other, positions that they can use to build groups, and to fortify divides. That's not what identity work is for in schools. And my understanding is that it's to build bridges, and to think about how we work together collectively in diverse groups towards solving problems that are much bigger than any one of our individual selves. So our problems were equivalent. That is to say, we started our conversations understanding both that we really liked this framework and that we were grappling with what happened when you didn't do service and equity together, and what the dangers were of leaving them siloed from each other. And then both of us had a common understanding that there was also a deep danger to not having it integrated into curriculum. Like, without it being assessed, without this kind of work being assessed, it becomes secondary to students' concerns. It needs to come into the classroom, and it also needs the classroom to help build reflective spaces for the work we do. Otherwise, it's just not it's not sustained reflection. It doesn't allow for that reflection we all know is so important for service. So the good side is because I work with a very strong and functional administrative team, we had a lot of people who were like, yeah, makes good sense. Go out there, work with teachers, get to teacher teams, do the work. And our head of school was completely behind it. The challenge is then Danielle left. It's now my job. So what's happened is what's replaced her are, I have 3 new hires under me who are working in each division. It's a K-12 school I work in. It's a girls' school. And so instead of rehiring a public purpose person, they have now hired 3 people that I work with closely on the equity curriculum team, is what we call it. And we work together to integrate all of this into the curriculum itself. So we're in that stage now, and we are working on thinking about what are the goals for lower school, what are the goals for middle school, and what are the goals for our upper school. And 3 distinct people have standards that they go by. And this is the kind of, to give you an example of how they're working, I just had a meeting an hour ago with my middle school dean of student life. He is right now crafting some retreats for our middle school, 6th grade. And we are also crafting a bigger picture vision communication on middle school with the parent community to understand what our goals are moving forward for next year and so forth. He's new in his role, so that's why he's writing this sort of welcome to middle school letter, or welcome himself to middle school letter. We use the standards to talk about what we're doing, and we highlighted good projects in certain classes that were doing that kind of work, who had reached out to us to do that kind of work. So we're starting to figure out ways of highlighting the early adopters for this kind of thing. We've trained all the faculty in our thinking on it, but that doesn't get people to do stuff. So the next step is to show people what it looks like in actual classrooms, to find people who are doing certain kinds of projects and really say, okay, great, these might be useful, look at these standards, how can we talk about it? And then making sure they get in front of faculty so that they can do the work of convincing people, because it can't be top down only. I think vision is important, but if we're just yapping up there all the time, it's not going to help anybody else. So I think I'll stop there, because I've already talked more than I'm used to talking in a row. I'm happy to field any questions, or then just move the conversation where, what are you all doing? What are ways to go forward? I mean, I think maybe it's useful just to say this last piece, which is that the biggest challenge right now is thinking about how do we manage the time it takes to actually build thoughtful projects? How do we build in that time, and how do we hold people accountable for a school vision? So those are our next conversations. And I will say also that it's the same conversation with our teaching and learning and director of curriculum directors. The 2 of them also do K-12 work, and they're on board with this vision, but we're working together. So this is not, again, only, this is understood as central priority, which is a huge gift, but it's not easy. So that's where we are.
Rebecca, did you see the question from Shayna on the side?
I just put it in the chat box, but I can just ask it. I wanted to write it so I didn't forget. I was just wondering if you'd be able to share an example of ways that you've seen it being integrated into the curriculum effectively, and then also speak a little bit to the assessment piece of, like those learning goals and the skill development, how we know the kids are getting it.
Yeah, so I can give an example of, there's a project right now in the middle school in 7th grade that we're developing. So a lot of this is in development. I haven't seen all these projects through. What they are doing is they are, they're reading a book called, what's it called? Seed Life. It's a very small little reader about a child who builds a community garden, or rather she builds a garden and the community starts to tend it. And the book is written as a series of people who watch her plant the first seed, but from different perspectives, and what their reactions are and how they engage with this garden. And it's a very lovely story. Many different races are represented. There's a kind of sense of, the possibilities of what you do, perspectives, the possibilities of what you do when you start something or build a seed. And the health program is going to talk about the power of social dynamics in community building. And they are going to talk about what their perspective is on a challenge or a problem. Each child is going to do that. And they will do that with a lot of racial literacy, knowing the health teacher, they'll talk also about what, what their actual cultural and racial backgrounds are as a process, as part of getting to their understanding of what their problem is, and then move from there. And the book does a good job of setting that up, because I think the little girl talks about her parent having been a migrant worker, and understanding that he had a real deep understanding of soil, and that's why this little girl like decides to plant this thing. I don't remember all the details of the book, but in any case, it's very well set up for them to have those conversations. And they are then going to choose problems, small problems in the community, and it's a middle school class, so they're not. She wants to have a conversation with me sometime next week about, what is the range of possibilities of the kinds of activities that they could do. But that's an example of this health teacher, Sally, was given, some time to think about how. In a faculty meeting where we went over what I just went over, Danielle and I went over with the middle school faculty. They were asked to sit with and think about their own curriculum, think about their own curriculum, and then have small group shares about what they might do. This is what came out of it. So she's now going to practice, but the assessment of it will then depend on, she has a rubric of, the reflective quality of why they've chosen the problem, the questions they ask, and then the assessment of the effectiveness or non-effectiveness will be part of their reflective writing at the end, and she will, or their thoughts about the project, and that's the piece that's an assessment piece. So that's what it would look like, for instance, in the middle school. Does that help?
Yeah. Is that housed in a language arts?
No, it's a health. There's a separate health program with a department.
And so this is all in health.
Yeah, and there's also an English class that's doing a similar thing, only it's about oral presentation, and they're building speeches about who they are and why it makes them believe in something, and they have to talk about what that believing in, what that thing is, so, and then they're graded on their oral presentation, like the actual presentation of it in English. And some of them are choosing to do public shares, and some of them are not. So, and meanwhile, we've pulled the advising curriculum. Used to be that we covered race in one advisory, class in one advisory, gender in another advisory, and we've stopped doing that, so that it can become part of the work that they do in classes. And that's really intentional. Like, we don't want to do it in an advising space that's not graded anymore. The kids, it's not working for them. But we're still learning what it could look like. I mean, there's a lot of ideas that we have, but a lot of work still needs to be done.
Do you think that that it's not working because it's not being assessed because kids don't take anything seriously that they're not being assessed, or because you're asking advisors who don't feel prepared to facilitate these conversations, that it's not, sort of doesn't carry the same weight as a teacher who's trained to have these conversations?
That's a great question, Blake. I think it's absolutely both. I think the advisors would say it's not working because I don't have the capacity. Many of them do say that. I think it's really stressful for them when they get to be, hey, Gabby. A lot of them get to be very, very disturbed by their advisories because they can't handle something, they can't manage something. And also advisory, it's also structurally there's not enough time for it. Like it's a 40-minute period, and they discuss gender in one day. And one of these advisories just last year had to, there's a kid in seventh grade. No, she was in 8th grade when she decided that she was going to go by they. She's now going by he as a 9th grader. But that child was in a woman who had never done any gender training, had never done any sort of equity training formally, beyond being in a school that sometimes had PD. And a really good teacher, a really, really great teacher, but without a depth of understanding how to manage that conversation. And that was happening all the time with race, and it was happening a lot with class. And so I think advisors were really, really struggling. Our next goal right now, we have a retreat this summer this same team has a retreat to look at the advising curriculum and figure out how to build advisor capacity around these issues, which is really ultimately also building teacher capacity, because they're all teachers as well. So
we talk about that all the time, about how advisory is so hard because you're asking, can you not hear me?
No, I'm sorry, I missed the first part.
I was just gonna say we talk about this a lot because we talk about empowering teachers to facilitate, like a lot of this falls in advisory, right? So if it's not curricular, it usually ends up in advisory, and some might consider that curricular. That's just a different part of their curriculum. Yeah. And so it sounds a little bit like you are taking the onus off of the advisors and really leaving it to, trained educators in these areas for now, as opposed to other schools are looking at how do we professionally develop all of our teachers to have these skills and competencies.
No, we're
doing both.
We're doing both. Yeah. So all of our teachers get trained in equity thinking, in some identity development currently. But to be honest, all of us need to be working. I think, as I'll speak for what I'm seeing as my charge, I think we all need greater and more consistent training beyond personal identity development training, although we need to have a very clear plan for personal identity development training, particularly, but not only, for our white faculty who haven't necessarily had a lot of personal identity development training.
Right.
But that's also true for a lot of our colleagues of color, what it means to be a professional colleague of color, what are the challenges, what are your responsibilities, what are the self-understandings that are necessary for maneuvering through a diverse work environment. So a lot of what we're talking about for kids that's necessary, I think is necessary for faculty and administration and staff as well. And I think it needs to be ongoing, and I think it needs to be intentional. So to that point, for instance, another thing I get to do at my school, because of the desire and interest of the people on the leadership team in particular, is the teaching and learning director and I are right now creating a plan for identity development, professional development that happens through the year. So a scope and sequence for all adults in the community of what their identity development work looks like through the course of the year, where are their opportunities, what's intentional and what's accountable, how are they accountable for that knowledge. And that's in order to get them to know how to manage being in a classroom or being in an advising space, and leverage and use their identity in ways that are appropriate based on whatever the identity is. So we're working on that simultaneously. And I think building the capacity of identity development, knowing that the ultimate goal is to help kids understand a deeper sense of purpose and to find their own strengths, right? So there's that great Dolly Parton quote, figure out who you are and then do it on purpose, that one. I think there's a sense that that's our job as educators, is to help the kids figure out who they are and then do that on purpose. And that includes doing good work in the world. And so that's where the service work comes in. And that's something we're thinking of, like, how do we build that really deep understanding into all of our teachers, that that's their goal of the school. And so then how it's not their goal is to figure out how their curriculum and their work matches and meets that mission of the school.
There's another question from Shayna. She's good at writing them on the side.
I don't know where the side is. Where's the side?
Sorry, it's in the chat box, but I can't keep things in my brain for more than 5 seconds.
No, down below, there's like a little, like a bubble.
Oh, okay.
Chat, and then it'll come up on the right.
Okay.
I do have 2 questions, and I'm not trying to monopolize, so people can tell me to sit down. Have you had your faculty across the board run an equity audit in their curriculum? And if so, how was that received and how did it go?
So we're in also the process. Part of the challenge here, this is year 2 for me. So we're still working on all of this stuff, but we are right now sitting, the director of curriculum, who works closely with the director of teaching and learning and myself, she and I have been tasked to do an equity audit with all department chairs. We've sat down with all department chairs. Our next round of sitting down is to sit down with all departments, full departments, not just department chairs, and get a sense of what folks are doing well and where their challenges are. And in the lower school, we're doing some deep work thinking about what getting an equity mapping of what people are doing around. And we now have standards that people have more or less bought into, because people are really game to have something common language that they can work on. So that's why the anti-bias framework, I can't emphasize enough that that's been really helpful, because it's just something to use. So that has been a framework. People are like, okay, we'll use this. That seems like it makes good sense how that's been explained. And if you look at the standards, they're not really that controversial. I mean, I can't imagine educators who would think any of that was not important to do in a school environment. So, so yes, we are doing an equity audit. We have not done one yet.
Okay.
Is that two?
Oh, no. All right, I'm gonna ask my other one, but please tell me to stop asking questions. So I'm just thinking about, like, let's say you're working with a new school that's just starting to implement this work. What are those really immediate measures that they should be taking to move in the right direction with, like, initially, so that will kind of limit the teacher pushback, but also increase buy-in? That's maybe a big question.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's different for every school, because I think the resistances are different in every school. I think for my school, what they started with, which I think was a good thing, but it also took a really long time, was deep identity development work. And I think schools could approach it. I don't know how to answer that, Shayna. I mean, I think it's so different for different schools.
I know.
But I will say that it was successful. I mean, as I said, it was really useful to me that people already, if I say to a teacher, any teacher on this campus, which is a remarkable thing to be able to say, well, you know, one of the important things to think about is, what does it mean to be a white teacher trying to teach this unit, or a black teacher teach this unit? There's not like a sense that, oh my God, she just called me black. Oh my God, she just called me white. Like, everybody is bought into the idea that we should be having those conversations. And I know that I'm lucky enough that a lot of places, part of the reason I'm here, a lot of places that would not be true, including at my old school, which was an incredibly progressive and strong. It's Lick Wilmerding High School, and it is a wonderful school, but that would not necessarily be well received by every teacher in that school. And it's professionally assumed that you should be able to talk that way in our school here. So that is because of work that came before me that was about really focusing on identity development, and particularly on race. So that helps with some of the other stuff. And I think it could be that you focus on something else. I mean, I would be curious what it looked like to really focus on class. But I do think it's helpful that it's one thing, because everything else can fall from that. I mean, people buy into the idea of identity once they bought into one identity marker being important, I think. So,
great.
Does anybody have any questions? No? I have questions, but I don't want to take up everybody's space.
I'm just curious, is this useful? Like, what I'm saying, is it useful? Is it?
Oh, it's great.
School? Because I can't read faces very well. I'm not sure what's going on for people. If this is, I'm trying to share what we've been trying to do here. But I also know schools are so different, and I am curious about what are the challenges that people are facing.
There is a new comment in the chat box. I don't know if you saw that.
So Angelica writes, she's getting an internet connection's unstable. She's wondering if you could share about how you apply some of this work with partner organizations. Work with partner organizations, with peer groups of students, or how do you practice identity development and diversity understanding?
So yeah, I think we're still, the short answer on that is that we're doing it really clearly in our communications with our partner organizations, like the ones that are our community organizations, I think are really on board with it. But it just takes reaching out, and it doesn't mean that, it means we try to think about, for instance, with the pantry, what kind of work we might do. So we just reached out recently to the pantry that we used to go and visit through the lower school and asked them what kind of work we could do that might be on site for them. Would that be, is there anything that was useful that the kids could do, that the lower school kids could do in their community, or work that they could do on site at the pantry without actually necessarily interfacing, because we said just educationally these kids are not ready for that interface at the K through 4 age, and they may be, I think next steps for us are thinking about if they will be ready more after they've done more foundational work in the lower school, but we're not there yet because we have to build up. So we're working with them right now on that, and recently they just did a drive in the lower school to send canned food over and toiletries over. So that, it feels in some ways, I think, to some people like we're pulling back on the service work, but in a lot of ways it's, I think if our mission is education of children for long-term good, then we need to keep that at the forefront. And I think in terms of the good for the pantry, as I understand it from our coordinators over there, it's equivalent, whether we come for a couple hours or we do that work in school. But I think there are parents who think that we're not as proactive and want more right now. And I think figuring out ways of doing that communication and messaging, we're still grappling with. It's hard. A lot of people want to see they want to see stuff. They want to see a certain kind of community engagement that looks familiar to them as community engagement. So I can't say I understand exactly how to manage that yet. I think I'm still trying to work with our division heads to figure that out and our communication around it. So.
Well, and I think it also, it takes a deep reflection in the traditions of the school, right? And the traditions of the partnerships, because sometimes things are done because they've always been done that way. And a lot of the legacy families feel committed to those things, but ultimately they're not approaching those learning goals, right? Like, for instance, Christmas pageants and things along those lines that are really inclusive just to Christianity and not taking into account other religions in schools, I think is a good way to start looking at where are you actually accepting diversity, and where are you, marginalizing people simply because this is the way it's always been done.
That's right, Shana. And particularly around the service projects, I think because parents have have historically often been part of those service projects, that's where they enter into the conversations. There is an attachment to the traditions of those. So.
Is there any inclusion of the parents in any of this work in terms of having parent learning workshops, or the parent association doing something around this so that they can simultaneously be getting the same training their kids are getting?
So
I'm not trying to give you more work to do. I'm just asking.
No, I'm smiling because it's a really good idea, but no, there hasn't been a ton of that. There's definitely identity development work going on. So I work really closely with the parent. Part of my challenge right now is really trying to figure out how much of my job is supposed to be being two people. Danielle was incredibly busy, and I have a lot on my plate as an equity director, period, just to get people to start thinking about the identity piece, and really thinking comprehensively is obviously more useful, but I try to keep the language consistent with something that I could follow up on, because as I said, this is what I believe about identity development work. It's only so good as it is useful for the kids to know how to act in the world. But that's all an excuse to say we haven't done a ton to share any of the standards with them, because they don't care about standards. Parents don't care about standards. So the vision work, yeah, I think we talk about it in terms of purpose and in terms of knowing how to be and transform the world. That's our mission. but I think we have more work to do on that, and I'm constantly trying to figure out. It feels, to be honest, like the flip side, I told a nice coherent story. The flip side of this is I often feel like that in order to do deep foundational work, that I don't, we are stopping a lot of things that aren't working well in terms of service work, but I worry that we are stopping too many things. So that's an ongoing challenge for me as we try to build systems that will work to actually ground our identity and service thinking in curricular work. We're stopping things that aren't working, which means some stuff isn't happening as much, right?
Right. And you're losing some of those relationships, right?
Well, I'm not necessarily, actually, luckily, because a couple of the organizations, for whatever reason right now, maybe because of how inequality is changing the world so rapidly, a couple of our organizations are undergoing massive reorg. Two of them in particular, both the Pantry and the Stanley Isaac Center, which is the community center and elderly home that is in our community, which we work very closely with. Both of them have asked us to do a hiatus year. So we're lucky there. But in terms of, I guess you guys were talking about internships earlier. In terms of some of the internship work that traditionally had we're trying to redesign that so it does all the things you were saying at the beginning, isn't only privileging those kids who have the connections, but that means the internship program is much smaller this year, that kind of thing. Like we just have different, we're a little lucky with two organizations, but we have a lot that is just sort of stopping, particularly with those where they're student driven.
Yeah, so your internship program is not grade wide.
It's up and running. It is grade wide. Yeah, no, it is, but it's just not robust. We have fewer and fewer signups, so forth and so on, because we haven't done a lot of legwork to get people. So I think we have about half what we did last year at this time. So those are the challenges. Like you have to figure, what do we always say? I mean, our admin team is constantly talking about the difficulty of retrofitting. We're retrofitting right now. We're not, we can't just build, and it's harder. It's harder in some ways, but I think we can do a really more beautiful job if we just don't completely tear it down and try to figure out how to work with what we've got. So that's what we're trying to do. Sorry for the bings, those are texting. I either turn you all off or I turn that off. So.
It's completely fine. I was thinking about, back to the sort of like the parent buy-in to this work when they still think traditionally they should be out doing service projects with their kids, and that's sort of the culture or historical culture of your school. I often liken the parents of lower school kids to lower school kids themselves, in that if you start to educate them when their kids are little about what the goals are for them to be as high schoolers and what the portrait of a Spence graduate looks like, then you can get early buy-in for kids as they progress through the school, and those standards will seem more valuable because they'll know what the end goal is from the very beginning, right? When you're the parent of a kindergartner, you're just happy somebody's going to tell you that your child at one point in time will be old enough to go to college and will have these skills. And so then if you buy into it early, then you move to acceptance, or even supporting and cheerleading those goals.
Yeah, that's definitely the hope. We're doing a lot of deep work. The lower school head in particular is aware of the K-12 vision in a way that's really useful. So I think that's really right. And I think that just the challenge of that is, parents are really, they have a lot of opinions in the lower school environment. And that particularly past kindergarten, because I agree with you, in kindergarten they're like, yay, someone's taking care of it, but then as they get older, they really want their kids to have certain kinds of experiences. So, and we're still grappling with, we're also doing work to try to think about all of those entry points, like also the college the college transition in upper school, where that becomes so focal and central to things. I think we need to work on and think about that. So I worked with the college office to include some language around purpose and around what kind of who they are and what their purpose is and why they and how they want to act in the world. That's part of their college reflection work in their junior year, so that they can know that the school values that. We just did that this year, so they're asked to write a piece about what their community is and how they have given back, or how they would expect or hope to give back. So for me, it's like I shouldn't use this analogy, but I'm going to do it because we don't have a ton of time. But just look, it's a multi-front attack. I mean, like you got to do it in lots of little teeny ways and get the language consistent and get your leadership on board. Because once they're on board, they'll have those micro conversations. I mean, the college counselors are on the leadership board. I go to them then and say, based on what we were talking about, what do you think about doing this? And they say, yeah, that would be interesting. Well, how does your work make sense with what we're trying to do here, and thinking about junior meetings and junior prep? And I was like, well, they're going to have to write college essays, so we could think about it like this could be an essay piece that they do like a draft essay of. And it's all brainstorming and working with people to get the buy-in that way in small little ways, but the vision should be brief, concise, and that's why I love the anti-bias framework so much. Like, it's so helpful. It's just so helpful because it has this like very concrete way of thinking about it that is easily explainable.
Going back to the language and college counselor, I've noticed it more and more, including the school that I mentioned at the very beginning, talking about internships and wanting to have equitable internships. Yeah. Their college counseling office is called Life Preparedness. Yeah. And so it takes college out of it. And they said that what's interesting is that they've seen an increase of recent grads coming back their junior and senior year in college, in college, to sort of also think about what their next steps are. So it's bringing some alums back onto campus as well. Yeah. And there's another school whose their entire upper school curriculum is called Life Ready.
Yeah, right.
So it's just another way to get people's minds to shift about, what we're doing and why. What's our purpose, right? Our purpose is to educate children to be the best that they can be. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that those micro switches also, they matter for parents, because it's something to refer to when parents say, but that isn't the point that we get into this place, right? Then it's affirmative work that helps you shield from that once you're in those conversations, instead of doing reactive work in the moment and trying to
right. And it's subtle, right? You start hearing that when your kid's little, and then that's just what it's called. You don't learn it any other way. So it's the Life Preparedness office, and they're going to help my kid be prepared for life, right? Not just for the next 4 years of their life.
And then it makes sense why they're doing like mental health workshops in the junior year, which our college office does, but it's still called the college office. So then it reads with the wrong messaging, right?
Right.
It's really good. Life preparedness.
I feel like I see it more. It's creeping, right? It's slow, but it's creeping, and it's great.
And it's little things in terms of, if you're trying to be a leader pushing vision forward, it's little things like I chose to be on the college counseling search in particular, so I could ask the kinds of questions that I wanted someone who would take this job to hear first from our leadership in their process. And so that I was really clear what given that Spence really believes in the importance of identity development for something longer and larger than, not just for college, but for life and for transforming the world. And knowing what language from the mission will help me, knowing what language from our philosophy statements will help me, and then getting into those spaces where I can make the kinds of decisions, including interviewing the right people, so that I can have input. I'm not saying I make every decision, but I can have input on saying that candidate was able to answer this question way better, right? And it's strategic. So for me, it's a lot about thinking about where are your transition points, what's faculty professional development, and Yeah.
It's great. It's just you, Ivy. You're the only one left.
Hi, Guyby. Nice to see you.
It's nice to see you. Apologies, I feel obligated because I came late. I have to be the last to leave, so.
No, you don't feel obligated. We all work in schools. We know.
Rebecca has to leave at 1, R1, year 10.
No worries. I mean, Rebecca, thank you for sharing, and apologies again for my tardiness, but what I hear coming up throughout what you're saying is just the culture piece, and I know Blake and I have been working on this in different corners and different aspects of how so much of this work, it's everything. You know, it's not just the college admissions, but it's what you do on the admissions side of things. It's what you do with your professional development. It's the onboarding. It's what's on the walls. It's what you're greeted by when you come into the building. I mean, it's kind of everywhere. And so I just feel that it's that totally enigmatic, nebulous thing that is just pervasive, and it's little things that can make big impacts. More often than not, it's those collections of little things. And that's what's so hard, because it has to be everywhere. You can't just, you know, my former head of school used to call it like moving the blob. You know, when you push here, the blob kind of comes in over here. And when you push here, it comes in over here. And it has to be kind of everywhere, you know? And that's what's so challenging about this, because you can't just focus on the curriculum, or you can't just focus on professional development. You can't just focus on college admissions. It really does have to be this all-out affront war on multiple aspects. And
yeah. And it makes me think, and I do have to run because I have a meeting across somebody's office.
Tell her you're with me.
I will. That's true. I can say that. I think what the blob means, it's also the fun of the job, I think, in some ways, because it means you have every right to be everywhere. And figure out what the impact is. And I think if you can think about it as offering yourself as a resource to a whole bunch of people and get in that way.
And at the same time, you can't be everywhere. So it can't also just be about one person, you know? And I feel like that's
take off and get
that's right. You know, that I have the utmost trust in my colleagues that when they're hiring candidates, it's not like I'm meeting with every candidate that's coming in. There's no way, you know? But I trust that they're doing this work, and I can't meet with every family that's coming in for the admissions process.
But
I trust
meet with everybody to build capacity for them to understand why service matters, right?
I mean, it's part of the air we breathe here, so it's a little bit of
you're different. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
You know, but at the same time, it also doesn't happen on its own. There is an intentionality that has to. You can't assume that everyone's going to know how to do this, or you know, whatever, fill in the blank. So it is I don't know, maybe I'm an engine behind one aspect of it, but I totally trust that my colleagues are championing this as well. So
yeah, well, yeah,
but, there's all these things that fall through the cracks, and we still struggle with, you know, the same issues and challenges that everybody else is, you know. So
I think so. I think we all are struggling with some stuff that's really hard about tradition. Like, one thing that, just before I run, I would love is to see if there's any way we could get a webinar on service mapping. Like, how are people mapping what work is happening, and they're just like, and that would be crowdsourced. Like, I would not want to hear from one person alone. What would be really cool is to have like 4 or 5 people be willing to speak about how they've mapped their service in their schools. Because if you can see what's happening, like that as a tool is really invaluable. Like, once you start sharing with people what's happening across the school, people, first of all, know it's a priority. Second of all, know, anyway, I think it'd be really useful to hear.
And build off relationships that are already established, and create curricular connections across grade levels, etc.
Yeah, build each other's projects.
Totally, I would totally agree. And I would say fundamentally how people are defining the service, because what you were saying too is when your parents are expecting like the drives and the kids going and volunteering, like that's one definition of service, as opposed to focus on relationships and reciprocity, that kind of thing, you know. So Anyways.
Are we going with you to your meeting?
Yeah, I gotta go, guys. Thank you so much, Blake.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Maybe I'll see you later. Okay.
All right. Good to see you.
Bye.
So Blake, tomorrow we're on. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Another one. This one was rescheduled because I got the flu.
Okay. No worries.
So yes, and I just said something simple about how about shifting service to engagement, and we only have, I think, like 7 people RSVP'd currently. So
Okay.
it might be a smaller group, but I don't, you know, you never know.
Yeah, totally. And we're also in the midst of a big schedule change. So I think it's really exciting. And next year, I feel like there's a lot of opportunities where we're going to kind of tweak and shift some things. And I mention that because, you know, the traditional model or the traditional framework of kids going out and, you know, doing their volunteer hours, or, you know, you got the cute picture of the kid planting the tree at the school. I kind of feel like that's important, and it's only one definition, I feel like, or one way to.
I agree so much.
And define service. And for us, again, it's so much about those relationships and engaging with organizations, as well as activating kids' sense of, I don't know, just like creativity and designing some sort of possible solutions or impact. I don't know.
Right.
Like, we're just looking at things maybe a little bit differently. So
and like risk taking, you know, when you're thinking about this stuff.
Yeah.
And if any talk about schedule, that's just one way a school shows support of this work is to break away from your traditional, even block scheduling is traditional at this point.
And the work that they're doing, and our whole scheduling team has kind of been influenced and inspired by some of their scheduling and blocks and whatnot. And this whole Corda method, are you familiar with that?
No.
Like it's either folks who were formerly at Hawken and they started this whole consulting thing. And it's basically a bunch of our faculty who were on that scheduling committee just went to a workshop, and they just it's so funny because they've just come back kind of like preaching this gospel of this whole Corda method. And it's really interesting because I think many of us are always skeptical when you have like that kind of like, and if you just do this, you know, it'll be this, you know, and, you know, it slices, it dices, it, you know, it's like all of that kind of, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is, right? So, you know, teachers are naturally skeptical, but, you know, when they came back from this, they were definitely chugging the Kool-Aid.
Corda.
Korda. And it's just basically a framework for project-based learning, and it's a very applicable and digestible, and we feel that with our new schedule, we have this new block called the Applied Learning Lab, which is this transdisciplinary thing that's going to be very project-based, very collaborative co-teaching model. And it's going to happen in a weekly fashion. And we're thinking about doing these kind of 3-4 week chunks where it's going to be able to lift up a particular aspect of a curriculum, but do it in ways that are looking at real world problems, you know?
Oh, cool.
So I think it's got a lot of possibilities. So I'm super excited about that.
I would never think of my son's school as innovative. Really, it's a pretty traditional magnet school for STEM, like technology.
Yeah.
They do, they have an IBET block. So they have 8 periods a week, and Monday they have every period, and then Tuesday, Thursday is 1 through 4, Wednesday, Friday is 5 through 8. They connect English, biology, and technology into 3 1.5-hour blocks every Tuesday, Thursday.
Yeah.
So it could be you have 3 separate classes, but they call it IBET, Integrated Biology, English, and Technology. Yeah. And it leaves them, they're doing this project right now where he spends 4.5 hours twice a week.
Yeah.
And it's really pretty cool. And it's the world's problems are not siloed
siloed into
Right.
this biology problem. This is an English problem. This is a math problem. I mean, it's all about that integration. And so I feel we're doing our kids a disservice if we silo these types of.
Oh, again, where do you go to work where you only work in English?
I know, seriously. My next meeting is here. I'm sorry.
Okay, you have to go. I'll see you tomorrow.
Tomorrow morning. Yeah, we'll make it happen.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
See you
bye.
later. Bye.